The collapse of the shearers' strike had a souring effect on many in Australia, and none more so than Henry Lawson, whose blood was already almost pure unsweetened lemon juice by this point. The man who had once dreamed of righteous revolutionaries marching through the Sydney slums was becoming increasingly bitter. He had contributed pieces to left-wing periodicals like The Worker, The Boomerang and The Bulletin, but was spending more and more time with his mates, as they put it, knocking about, and as others put it, going on benders and making scenes at bookstores. So in September of 1892, the editor of The Bulletin stuck Henry on a train and sent him to Bourke. The hope was that deporting one of Australia's brightest emerging bush poets to the actual bush would generate a wealth of new stories and poems, as well as dry him out. Others were more sceptical. Bulletin fixture A.G. Stevens said, "Here was this unfortunate townie, deaf and shy and brooding, sent with a railway ticket and a few spare shillings to carry his swag through an unknown land where he knew nobody. He blistered his feet and got sore eyes and bellyache. The bush didn't understand him and he didn't understand the bush." Lawson did not enjoy his time in Bourke, nor did it put him off his drinking, but it did provide material for new stories and poems. In his time there, he travelled and worked with roving station hands. He described what this was like in a letter to his aunt. "I carried my swag 200 miles since I wrote to you, and I am now camped on the Queensland side of the border, a beaten man. No work and very little to eat. We lived mostly on Johnny cakes and cadged a bit of meat here and there at the miserable stations. Once I get back to Bourke, I'll find means to get back to Sydney, never to face the bush again. You can have no idea at the horrors of the country out here. Men tramp and beg and live like dogs. It is 2 months since I slept in what you call a bed. We walk as far as we can, according to the water, and then lie down and roll ourselves in our blankets. The flies start at daylight, and we fight them all day till dark, and then the mosquitoes start." There's an open question in Australian history about where our conception of the outback comes from, with its ethos of mateship, the battler, and the fair go. The bush and the bushmen were romanticised in hundreds of poems and stories in the 19th century, including many that were purportedly true to life. But how much of this was accurate, and how much was simply projection from writers who mainly lived in the city? Was there really a culture of mateship among the bushmen, where they opened their purses to each other and lived like brothers? The journalist William Lane thought so, but that's exactly what a socialist zealot would see, with a bit of wishful thinking and a heaping dose of condescension thrown in. Did people in the bush really talk non-stop about how sexy horses are? Banjo certainly thought so. And on a similar note, was the bush really a desolate land of violence and suffering? Or was Henry Lawson just kind of always in a shitty mood? "I've been accused of painting the bush in the darkest colours from some equally dark personal motives," he said. "I might be biased, having been there, but it is time the general public knew the back country as it is, if only for the sake of the bush outcasts who have to tramp forever through broiling mulga scrub and baking lignum, or across blazing plains by endless tracks of red dust and grey, through a land of living death." His brief stint in the outback had poisoned Lawson against the bush, and also the people who lived there. The little idealism he once had evaporated in the heat somewhere outside of Bourke. One of Lawson's friends, who was a great believer in the cause of unionism, recalls Henry bringing him back down to earth. "Now listen," Henry said, "I know what I'm talking about. I couldn't say it in public because my living depends partly on what I'm writing for The Worker, but you can take it from me, Jack, the Australian worker is a brute and nothing else." His friend put this cynicism down to the bitterness in his heart after experiencing the careless, rough company of the shearing sheds. It was Marcus Clarke who said that there was a weird melancholy to the Australian bush. Here nature was so hostile, so brutish, that men in time believed that God had cursed both man and the country itself, and hence its barrenness, its sterility, its unsuitability for the arts of civilized human beings, he wrote. In Australia, the spirit of the place makes a man aware of his insignificance, of his impotence in the presence of such harsh environment. In his stories, Lawson painted the bush with a similar brush. Lawson's bleakest depiction of life in the outback is from a short essay called Crime in the Bush, where he talks about the solitary, unnatural existence of families living in almost total isolation. He says, "There are hundreds of out-of-the-way places in the nearer bush of Australia where families live for generations in mental darkness, almost inconceivable in this enlightened age and country. Some of these families live from one year's end to another without seeing a face except the face of somebody of their own class. Conceived and bred under the shadow of exile, hardship, or trouble, the sullen, brooding spirit which enwraps their lonely, bush-buried homes will carry further their moral degradation. You may sometimes see a dray or spring cart of antiquated pattern dragging wearily and unnoticed into the township and containing a woman, haggard and spiritless looking, or hard and vicious-faced, or else a sullen, brooding man who sells produce for tea, flour, and sugar, and goes out again within the hour, without perhaps having exchanged half a dozen words with anyone. This is the only hint conveyed to the outer fringe of God's country, and wasted on apathetic neighbours, of the existence of such a people. Perhaps the cruelest of all the bad sights of the bush is the case of the child born to a family with which it has nothing in common mentally, the throwback to original and better stock, whose bright mind is slowly but surely warped to madness by the conditions of life under which the individual is expected to be contented happy. Such warped natures are often responsible for the worst sexual crimes. Then there is the unprovoked, unpremeditated, passionless, and almost inexplicable bush murder, when two mates have lived together in the bush for years, until they can pass days and weeks without exchanging a word, till the shadow of the overhanging, brooding ridge, or the awful monotony of the horizonless plain, deadens and darkens the mind of one, so that the very presence of his mate, perhaps, becomes a constant source of vague but haunting irritation. Then, one day, being behind the other with an axe or an adze to his hand, he suddenly but dispassionately smashes his skull, and is afterwards utterly unable to account for his action, except by the muttered explanation that he had to do it, or something made me do it. Lawson wasn't the only Australian writer of the time whose descriptions of the bush were coloured by a deeper personal melancholy. In 1870, the day after seeing the first edition of his newly published book, Australian author Adam Lindsay Gordon travelled to a beach in Brighton, where he shot himself in the head. In 1892, the Australian poet Barcroft Boak was found in the scrub at Middle Harbour, hanging from a tree by his stockwhip. It's pretty grim stuff. But that's enough of all that. In Banjo's poems, there's none of this rubbish. No one needs saving except the occasional damsel in distress from an out-of-control Brumby, and no one's sad except for the occasional poor rube stuck behind a desk in a city. It's the people in the city who need their souls saved, and they can do it just by packing up and heading out into the bush, into, as he says, the vision splendid of the sunlit plains extended, all the happy times entrancing, days of sport and nights of dancing, moonlit rides and stolen kisses, pouting lips and loving glance. In 1892, Lawson approached Banjo with a proposal. Banjo recalled, "One day he suggested that we should write against each other, he putting the bush from his point of view, and I putting it from mine. We ought to do pretty well out of it," he said. "We ought to be able to get in 3 or 4 sets of verses before they stop us." And so the two writers, Banjo Paterson and Henry Lawson, faced each other in literary combat in the famed Bulletin debate, a poetry battle over the very soul of the Australian outback. In the red corner, Andrew Barton Paterson, aka The Banjo, author of Man from Snowy River and Clancy of the Overflow, who pranced through rural New South Wales like Tom Bombadil, writing happy stories about horses that honestly read like some kind of Western-themed My Little Pony fanfiction. And in the blue corner, coming in at 6 feet 2 inches, 5'8" if you include his posture, Henry Lawson, aka Barmy Ari, aka Sad Max, whose depictions of country Australia, well, they also contained a lot of horses, but in a dark way, like gritty, emo My Little Pony fanfiction. It was a battle over who knew the Australian bush and who was just a poser. Lawson kicked things off. "I am back from up the country, very sorry that I went, seeking for the southern poet's land whereon to pitch my tent. Desolation where the crow is, desert where the eagle flies, paddocks where the loony bullock starts and stares with reddened eyes, land where gaunt and haggard women live alone and work like men, till their husbands gone a-droving will return to them again." Banjo shot back a couple of issues later. "But the bush hath moods and changes, as the seasons rise and fall, and the men who know the bushland, they are loyal through it all. But you found the bush was dismal and a land of no delight. Did you chance to hear a chorus in the shearers' huts at night? Did they rise up William Riley by the campfire's cheery blaze? Did they rise him as we rose him in the good old droving days? Is not such a life much better than the squalid street and square, where the fallen women flaunted in the fierce electric glare? Banjo ended his poem with a personal jab. You had better stick to Sydney and make merry with the push, for the bush will never suit you and you'll never suit the bush. That really characterises the whole debate. It went a lot like those stolen valor videos on YouTube, where soldiers film themselves challenging military fakers who walk around wearing the uniform in shopping centres.
Here it is, guys. Stolen valor at its finest.
Oh, so you're a bushman? Which shearing station did you work at? Who is your commanding stock hand? Lawson gave as good as he got with his next piece. It was pleasant up the country, Mr. Banjo, where you went, for you sought the greener patches and you travelled like a gent. True, the bush hath moods and changes, and the bushman hath him too, for he's not a poet's dummy, he's a man the same as you. But his back is growing rounder, slaving for the absentee, and his toiling wife is thinner than a country wife should be. And in short, we think the bushman's being driven to the wall, but it's doubtful if his spirit will be loyal through it all. Banjo returned fire, with their dreadful dismal stories of the overlander's camp, how his fire is always smoky and his boots are always damp, and they paint it so terrific it would fill one's soul with gloom. But you know, they're fond of writing about corpses and the tomb. So before they curse the bushland, they should let their fancy range, and take something for their livers and be cheerful for a change. Well, it ain't all damp and dismal, and it ain't all lonely grave, and of course there's no denying that the bushman's life is rough, but a man can easy stand it if he's built of sterling stuff. Though it's seldom that the drover gets a bed of eider down, yet the man who's born a bushman, he gets mighty sick of town. For his jotting down the figures and his adding up the bills, while his heart is simply aching for a sight of southern hills. In the pages of the Bulletin, it seemed like the debate ended in something of a truce, with no real victor declared. But Banjo's vision of the bush was vindicated by his book sales. In 1895, his first collection of poems was released, called The Man from Snowy River and Other Verses, and it sold out in its first week. The reviews were gushing, even the British ones, with Rudyard Kipling himself offering praise. It is stirring, manly stuff that one rejoices to read and remember, wrote A.G. Stevens in the Bulletin. The banjo rides and wins his steeplechasing, and then, one may believe, sits down with a still tingling pulse and conveys the tingling to the pulses of his readers. Banjo was loving life, except for the lawyering part, but everything else was great. Playing polo, drinking and bullshitting at the Sydney Club, being a man about town and a beloved literary icon. But while his star was rising, there was one aspect of his life that stubbornly remained in stasis: his relationship with his fiancée, Sarah Riley. The two had gotten engaged in 1888 and had remained engaged ever since. Banjo himself was infatuated, publishing a love letter to her in the early years of their engagement. Oh, I love you, sweet, for your locks of brown, and the blush on your cheek that lies, but I love you most for the kindly heart that I see in your sweet blue eyes. In 1895, as he was basking in the positive reviews from his book, Banjo headed to Dagworth Station in Queensland, operated by the family of his fiancée's childhood best friend, Christina McPherson. The previous year, Dagworth and the McPherson brothers had been at the centre of another dramatic shearing strike. At Dagworth, the McPherson brothers, along with 20 men and a policeman, holed themselves up with their guns to stop their farm from being put to the torch. At night, the Unionists attacked them in force, and a gun battle ensued, but the brothers couldn't stop their shed from being burnt to the ground, and in the morning they saw that their property was ashes, and their lambs had been burnt alive. After the battle, one of the Union leaders was found dead near a billabong outside of town, having apparently shot himself rather than face trial. This was the raw material for the song Waltzing Matilda, but the spark that led to its creation was Banjo's fiancée's best friend, Christina McPherson. When he was at Dagworth, Christina started playing a marching tune she'd heard at Warrnambool on the zither. With the story of the strike and the suicide fresh in his head, Banjo started riffing and making up some lyrics. The expression Waltzing Matilda was already known as slang for a man taking his swag into the bush, but like so much of our bush mythos, it's debatable as to how accurate that is. Before the song was conceived, Henry Lawson had snottily written that A swag is not generally referred to as a bluey or a Matilda. It is called a swag. No bushman thinks of going on the wallaby or walking Matilda or padding the hoof. He goes on the track, when forced to. It does sound nice though, so Banjo used it as the basis for his chorus. With Christina on the zither and Banjo scatting out lyrics, the two began creating Waltzing Matilda together. But this collaboration obviously wasn't completely innocent. Nobody is necessarily saying that Banjo and Christina hooked up at Dagworth, but the attention he was lavishing on another woman was inappropriate at best, and the lyrics he was spitting off the top of his head were a little too revealing. You know, him and Christina were doing this in front of her family and his fiance's family, and it was a little bit awkward when he was sort of coming up to her singing, "It's fine to kiss people who aren't your fiancé." Christina's grandniece, though not present at the time, later said that Banjo's behaviour was caddish, and that the McPherson brothers instructed him to never darken their doorstep again. It was just a part of the family history, the broken romance with Sarah, and the fact that it was over him making passes at Chris, she said. He was obviously a ladies' man, and he sort of cast a flirty eye upon Aunt Chris, and she'd been so lonely and innocent. It's no wonder she sort of fell for him. He was obviously a very, very attractive man. And so after the spontaneous, magical outburst of luck and creativity that led to the creation of Waltzing Matilda, Banjo Paterson awoke at Dagworth Station to find that his engagement to Sarah Riley was now off. It was the second most distressing awakening you can possibly imagine for Banjo Paterson. But Banjo Paterson was not the only one blindsided by the throes of young love. In Sydney, Mary Gilmore was starting to grapple with the idea of settling down. "This day my feet are set on the junction of 3 paths," she wrote. "One leads to the desolate regions of old maidism, the second to the devil, the third to marriage and probably misery." It's clear that she saw her options in Sydney as somewhat limited. Her family had not made her a suitable romantic match, and she couldn't go 2 steps without hearing poor old Henry Lawson saying, "Mary, do you think it's possible for a man socialist and a woman socialist to be just comrades?" So Mary chose the path that she wanted to go down, and it turned out to lead her to Paraguay. In October of 1895, as Banjo was cheerfully making his way to Dagworth Station, she set sail for South America. Later in life, she said that Henry Lawson came to her the night before she left. "He broke right down. He begged me not to go. 'If you go, I am ruined,' he said. 'My life will never be worth anything again.' He was there again the next day when the ship set sail. Henry's sad face was the last face I saw," Mary wrote. "His voice the last I heard. He looked like one lost and hopeless." So why was Mary going across the ocean? Well, if you remember back to the shearing strike part of last episode, you'll recall the description of the shearers' camp at Barcaldine. Men living together in the outback, with nothing but tents and mateship, cooking together, playing cricket, singing songs. That camp was always intended to be temporary, but the image of the strikers' commune resonated deeply with a man called William Lane, who defined socialism simply and reductively as being mates. The papers called William Lane the arch-conspirator and man behind the curtain, who orchestrated the shearers' strike of 1891 from the shadows. They painted the image of a quiet and intense man of letters whose unassuming exterior concealed a rabid, bloodthirsty extremist. But a poet who met Lane in 1891 offered a different view of him. "I came to the conclusion that Lane belonged to a type which will engage itself in revolutionary conspiracy for the sheer thrill of it, and without any real desire for action," he said. "It is somewhat feminine in character, with a strong leaning towards the dramatic." William Lane was a small, bookish man, with glasses and a droopy moustache like Henry Lawson's. He had a club foot, so he walked with a limp and a cane. But even without his disability, it's hard to see him ever working alongside the strapping, strong-jawed Australian workers that he so idolised. He's just too intense. He was so passionate in his loves and his hates that his presence could be either mesmerising or completely exhausting. There was never much middle ground about anything with William Lane. His biography gives a glimpse as to what the man was like in person. When the missionary glow was upon him, he would talk endlessly, snatching an hour of sleep occasionally, puffing everlastingly on his pipe, or supping tea, quoting from poet, philosopher, and historian, swinging along with grand periods of economic analysis, stopping halfway through a sentence with a faraway look of mysticism in his eyes. In contrast, when confronted with people who didn't share his views, he would apparently turn silent and sullen, and then, later on, wail on his typewriter. Lane and his family arrived in Brisbane 6 years before the Great Shearers' Strike of 1891. In that time, he'd become a prominent figure in the union movement and the left-wing media. His own newspaper, The Boomerang, was staffed at one point by Henry Lawson. But in the early days, when it was William Lane's baby, he would fill it cover to cover with histrionic pieces written under several different aliases about the horrors of Australian working conditions and the malignant presence of the Chinese. Non-white labourers in Australia, like the Afghan cameleers or Chinese miners on the goldfields, were violently loathed by the Australian union movement. There was theoretically an economic rationale to this hatred, as non-white workers were often used by businesses to break up unions and undercut wages. But make no mistake, this was not an economically motivated hatred. This was plain old white supremacy, and if all wages were magically quadrupled overnight, the Australian workers and people like William Lane would still have had a fierce burning hatred for non-white people in Australia. In Australia, William Lane wrote 2 books in which he laid out his guiding philosophies. One was called The Working Man's Paradise, an Australian labour novel, published in 1892 after the shearing difficulty, in order to raise funds for the imprisoned strike leaders. The book follows a very familiar figure in Lane's personal pantheon, the noble Australian worker, a chesty, humble figure who's got 2 things on his mind: working hard and being mates. In the preface, William Lane said that one of the purposes of the book was to explain unionism a little to those outside it, and socialism a little to all who care to read or hear, whether unionists or not. All that any religion has been to the highest thoughts of any people, socialism is, and more, to those who conceive it aright. Without blinding us to our own weaknesses and wickednesses, without offering to us any sophistry or cajoling us with any fallacy, it enthrones love above the universe, gives us hope for all who are downtrodden, and restores to us faith in the eternal fitness of things. Socialism is indeed a religion, demanding deeds as well as words. Not until professing socialists understand this will the world at large see socialism as it really is. And then there's his other book, which I guess is more of a sci-fi, kind of in the vein of Bright. White or Yellow, a story of the race war of AD 1908, is set in a dystopian future where the Chinese have taken over and the white man is on the run. So the plot of the book is, it's an ultra-racist revenge fantasy, kind of a Red Dawn situation where a secret league of white people rise up and kind of topple this Chinese oligarchy that's taken over Australia. Here's an excerpt. "There's only one way, Mr. President," he said. "We can fire Chinatown within an hour. We can burn down every Chinese store and house and plough up every Chinese garden. We can hang every white man who is a traitor to the whites in this war. And we can start to do this throughout Queensland, perhaps throughout Australia, this very night." Even before the shearers' strike basically broke his already hysterical psyche, William Lane was privately exploring the possibility of setting up a socialist commune in South America. The continent was promising to him because it was full of, apparently, bountiful, cheap land. The remoteness would discourage those who weren't serious about things, the cultural isolation would force them to make a proper go of it, and the elevation was good because, as he said to a friend, "We must go high, I think, to get the true Aryan climate." As the trial of the so-called strike masterminds was taking place, this thought bubble started to take on a sense of urgency, and so William Lane began to earnestly draw people to his cause. An independent colony established in the rich fields of South America by the vigorous white Australian bushworker under socialist principles. William Lane had the unshakable fervour of a cryptocurrency enthusiast and the vocal stylings of a shopping network presenter. And his idea, while definitely left field, wasn't completely alien. The 19th century saw a bunch of communes form around various ideas of utopia. New Australia, as Lane called it, wasn't even the weirdest utopian commune in Paraguay. That honour went to New Germania, founded by Nietzsche's sister around Aryan principles. They picked the landlocked nation because it was pretty much the furthest place they could think of from Jewish people. Still, the idea that the misfits, failures and malcontents of the left wing of Australia, as one commentator put it, would go to a miasmatic land of half-breeds, goiter and assorted pestilences, as another commentator put it, in order to establish some sort of socialist utopia, it attracted its fair share of derision. It was popularly treated, as a third commentator stated, as one of the most feather-headed expeditions ever conceived. Many in Labour circles were furious that Lane was fracturing the movement and essentially retreating from the battle in Australia. When the shearers' strike ended, some of the most passionate unionists had reconvened under the Great Ghost Gum Tree in the Barcaldine camp to strategise a new approach. They decided that they needed to change the system from within and formed the Queensland Labour Party. Following federation, this would morph into the Australian Labour Party, which treated the ghost gum in Barcaldine as a spiritual symbol of their ideals. Lane was basically just blowing a raspberry at the whole idea of electoralism and turning the left into a laughingstock for the newspapers. But he was still able to attract hundreds of followers to his cause from around the colonies, and one of the most strident voices in the recruitment was Mary. When they met in 1892, Mary was 27 years old. As described by one acquaintance, a tall, straight, lissom, alert-eyed and jolly-voiced maiden in a white blouse and a scarlet belt. The scarlet belt she wore was for socialism, and she had been spending her time raising money, food and clothing for families of strikers and for the unemployed. She was the first woman to join the Australian Workers' Union and had even, according to her, helped hide a wanted unionist from the police by saying that he was her brother. Mary and William first met at McNamara's bookshop in Sydney, which was a popular hangout for radicals and intellectuals. In her journal, Mary wrote, "William Lane came to see me, earnest, strong in conviction, generous-hearted and tender-hearted, a man to whom truth is more than all else. He awakens and he gives. A man with whom utter kindliness abides. It is good to have touched his hand." Mary later said that William Lane was one of 3 men who most influenced her life, that she had the capacity to worship others, and that through the New Australia movement she came to worship Lane. William recruited Mary to help run the New Australia publication, which aimed to sell their cause to prospective colonists. "I know that the men and women who are carrying this thing on are actuated by true and honourable motives," she wrote. "I do give my faith to the movement and my heart to its working." Before the first ship left for Paraguay, Lane and his apostles were in recruitment mode, working to sell the idea that paradise was just a boat trip and a £60 cash deposit away, that New Australia would not end up like Old Australia, or like the prediction of the Sydney Bulletin, which prophesied that there will be a few hundred people digging and fencing in a dreamy, hopeless fashion out in the great loneliness and living on woe and unsaleable vegetables and dreams of home, and, meanwhile, the founder of the settlement will be foaming at the mouth and uttering poetry beneath a tree and wildly asking the damp ferns, "What is life?" It was in her capacity as a New Australia advocate that Mary met David Stevenson, a Queensland bushman and a Laneite, who was the very image of the manly man type that got both William Lane and Mary Gilmore all hot and bothered. Lane actually used David Stevenson as the model for the main character in his book, who is described like so: a Downs native, every inch of him. He stood 5 feet 11 in his bare feet, yet was so broad and strong that he hardly looked over the medium height. His forehead, nose and chin were large and strong. His lips were strangely like a woman's. A breath of the Great Plains came from his sunburnt face and belted waist. It was pretty much just this guy again. David and Mary would talk for hours. Occasionally they would talk for so long that he missed his last ferry home, and in those cases he would strip off his clothes, tie them in a bag, and swim across Sydney Harbour back home. He was a man of action. After failing to secure a donation for New Australia from one of Sydney's elite, he commented to Mary, "I never felt so much like shooting a man in my life. When I was leaving, it was all I could do not to turn back and kick pain into his body if I could not talk pity into his heart." Together, the group spent so much time talking up the prospects of New Australia that the planned commune took on elements of science fiction. Not only would everyone be happy and strong and well-fed, but the people within the commune would be so enlightened that they would form the next step of human evolution. The men, said William Lane, are what the average man hundreds of years hence will be. In a speech delivered in Tasmania to encourage single women to sign up for New Australia, he said, "Every single girl who joins us can die an old maid if it pleases her to be so erratic, but as our bachelors will be as fine a body of men as ever came together in any part of the world, strong and straight and manly with the manliness which town life destroys, and as there will be neither fear of want or any financial difficulty to impede honest love and honourable marriage, the single girls who go will be less than human if one or the other of these men do not win their hearts and make them loving wives and happy mothers." Now, I'm not saying that Mary Gilmore went to New Australia to chase boys, but at that point in her life, hearing statements like that, she definitely would have been like, In mid-1893, the first shipload of settlers were ready to set sail, containing William Lane, David Stevenson, and about 200 others. Mary wasn't on the first ship, as Lane wanted to get the colony established before opening the door to single women, but it was widely understood that she and David Stevenson were unofficially engaged, and that when the time came for her to join him in Paraguay, the two would get hitched. As the ship left Sydney Harbour, Mary describes waving it goodbye until her arm was numb. The worker newspaper covered the departure of the ship. Up aloft in one of the lifeboats stands William Lane, his pale face, worn with work and worry, now aglow with a sweet, unselfish joy. 3 cheers, sturdy, hearty and true, for freedom, Lane and Paraguay, and we turn back to the old scenes and look our last on the Royal Tar tossing beyond the heads, with her sails and spars standing out against a sunny day. But when Mary made it there, 2 years later, it was to find that both the Utopia and her prospective marriage had completely disintegrated. The problems for both of these things started on the ship there. The sea journey was just shy of 2 months, shorter than travelling from London to Sydney, but long enough to get pretty sick of everyone else on board. The passengers on the ship were all brothers and sisters in mateship, equal under the banner of socialism. Having said that, a pedant might be able to perceive some subgroups within that fleet. There was the divide between the bushmen and the city folk, the former being predominantly Queensland shearers radicalised by the strike, the latter being more familiar with the theory side of unionism and socialism. Then there was the gender divide. Though the ship contained only one unmarried woman, a nurse called Clara Jones, who was required by law to accompany them for health and safety reasons, many of the male settlers brought their wives with them. Then there was the subtle distinction that would gradually become more and more apparent as the experiment wore on, the one that divided the New Australians into what would come to be called the Royalists and the Rebels. As is apparent from the way people like Mary Gilmore and David Stevenson followed him, William Lane had something of a cult of personality around him. Consequently, the principles that New Australia was founded on were not strictly socialism or communism so much as they were Laneism. From the established school of socialism and communism, he'd taken the common hold of property, the equal division of wealth and food, and the principle of communal government. But there was also adherence to the colour line, meaning no intermarriage outside the white race and limited fraternisation with non-white people. Lane was one of those people who thought that the English had already diluted their racial purity by assimilating the Celts and the Scots, so you can imagine what he thought about ethnic groups that weren't native to the British Isles. Another element of Laneism was the strict teetotalism. The drinking of alcohol by New Australians was absolutely forbidden. William Lane had an alcoholic father and witnessed firsthand the destruction caused by liquor. His aversion was understandable, but that was the thing. His whole political philosophy seemed to be just based around his personal likes and dislikes. Essentially, you had a fanatical leader who demanded absolute obedience to a set of rigid commandments, and a group of people who were, by definition, prone to rebel against authority. The chemistry was always going to be interesting, to say the least. After the cheers had faded and Sydney Harbour had dipped over the horizon, the first fleet settled in for a long journey. Various committees were formed, a literary union was started, a new Australian flag was designed. In every socialist project, no matter the era, there's always an early participant who goes, "I'll be in charge of the music," and this was no exception. There was an official marching song which went, "Shoulder to shoulder, mates, shoulders together. Hands clasped in hand, my mates, fair and foul weather." But it was two people walking hand clasped in hand, shoulders together, that caused the first spell of foul weather for this ship of mates. Mary Gilmore's sort of fiancé, David Stevenson, had hit it off with the sole single woman on board, the nurse Clara Jones. They were hanging out constantly, talking well into the night, and taking romantic strolls on the deck. David, as it turned out, was a bit of a raconteur. The very things that Mary and William loved about him, his irrepressible laddishness and virility, made him not a great long-distance boyfriend. His whole shtick was being a rugged outdoorsman who could also write poetry, and that slayed with the New Australian female 18 to 34 demographic. Who could resist a poem like this, which was found in David Stevenson's journal? "The girls are the boys for me, bright faces all spanking with glee. Roguish and sly, some are modest and shy, but all are attractive to me." To put an end to this canoodling, Lane issued a prohibition forbidding unmarried women to be on the deck after 6 p.m. without their parents. There was only a single person on the entire ship to whom this decree could possibly apply, so the pointed message was definitely received. This was the first warning sign for William Lane's leadership. His political sermonizing was rife with fire and brimstone, but his leadership style amounted to sticking passive-aggressive notes on the fridge. The passengers objected to both the content and the manner of this pronouncement, and after a lot of back-and-forth argument, it was never actually enforced. And then there was the great cutlery battle. One of the drawbacks of ship life is the attrition rate of knives, forks, and plates, which steadily go overboard during the voyage, meaning that for the first few meals you get to enjoy eating from that special occasion matching dish set without any blemishes. And for the last couple of weeks you're basically eating from upside down lunchbox lids using chopsticks and drinking from your keepsake Hoyt's Age of Ultron cup like you're in a share house again during a month-long standoff over whose turn it is to clean the mouldy pile of dishes in the sink. Soon enough, William Lane, who one soon-to-be colonist said had taken to hiding in his cabin like a sulky child, was accused of hoarding the remaining plates and cutlery for his own private use. But after 2 months of bickering and stewing, everyone breathed an immense sigh of relief when the ship finally landed in Buenos Aires. Unfortunately, despite William Lane's injunctions to stay on board while arrangements were made on shore, several members of the expedition decided to head into town and get wasted. This pretty much set the tone for how things were going to play out henceforth. Around 20 years earlier, Paraguay had declared war simultaneously on Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, annihilating its population, particularly on the male side. This was why the Paraguayan government was so encouraging towards foreign settlement within its borders. But that also made it the worst possible place for a community containing a large number of bachelors who were supposed to remain both sober and chaste, at least in relation to women whose skin tone is anything duskier than ivory. And so, predictably, things started falling apart. The camp divided into those who were loyal to Lane and those who weren't. People fought and people gossiped. The colony struggled with farming and housing, and soon enough, the purges began. Lane expelled a group of colonists for breaking the rules of New Australia, mainly drinking, and a large number of settlers walked off in sympathy with them. But the infection was too far along. Amputating the 5th columnists could not stop the deterioration of the colony, and neither could fresh transfusions. A second ship of colonists arrived in early 1894. They had some inkling that things had not quite gone to plan in Paraguay, but they were not prepared for the extent of the shambles. Also, on the second fleet to New Australia, there had been another highly damaging argument over knives and forks. Said one member, "We were called together at 8 o'clock last night to hear both sides of a dispute between Mr. Casey and another man who had been quarrelling over some spoons." The whole thing was absurd right through. Everybody seemed annoyed at the idea of bringing such a paltry matter up. William Lane's hopes that the new batch of pilgrims might signal a fresh start for the colony were in vain. Upon landing, one passenger got off the ship, punched him in the face, got back on the ship, and returned to Australia with his family. The absurdity hit its peak in May 1894, when, less than a year after the first ship landed, William Lane decided that he was once again going to secede. He had left old Australia for the fertile plains of New Australia, and when they turned out to be less than he had envisioned, he left New Australia with 58 other colonists to found a New Australia, a colony called Cosme, 72 kilometres south from the original settlement. And so, when Mary Gilmore left Sydney in 1895, it was to join Colonia Cosme, not New Australia. She had not been deterred by the defections or the gossip or the schism, and still maintained her faith in William Lane as a leader. While the first shipment of colonists had restricted the quota of single women to just the nurse Clara Jones, now that the settlements were more established, Lane was openly calling for women to come to Cosme, though Mary was the only unmarried woman to take him up on the offer. But while she was unmarried, technically, she still believed herself unofficially engaged to David Stevenson, even though he had not sent her a single letter since he had left, and her trip to South America was just as much about tying that down as it was about enjoying the fruits of Lane's socialist utopia. In her luggage she had packed material to make a wedding dress, and in her journal she wrote, "I am tired of the gilded chaff of single life, and my being craves for the more substantial food of married life, even though it be rye bread." David Stevenson, though he had joined the double secessionists and moved to Cosme, was not partial to the rye bread of married life. Hearing the wedding bells slowly coming for him across the Atlantic Ocean, he hunkered down in Cosme. When Mary arrived in Paraguay, Dave was not there to meet her at the train station like she expected. Rather than being escorted to the colony on his arm, she instead had to stay in the city overnight and wait for William Lane's brother to pick her up. John Lane's daughter recalls that Stevenson refused to meet Mary because he was, quote, a bit of a Casanova, and didn't consider himself engaged to Mary. Poor Papa had to ride 20 miles through the Pampas. If it seems like I'm poking a bit of fun at Mary's expense, rest assured that things turn out alright for her in Cosme. Her tough bush upbringing made her well suited to the primitive state of the colony, and it would take more than some communist fuckboy to crush her spirits. Though she had been published in Australian newspapers, and basically ran the New Australia Journal single-handedly after the departure of Lane from Sydney, compared to Henry and Banjo, Mary was a bit of a late bloomer in terms of her literary career. It was her time in Cosme that seemed to really launch her career as a poet. In fact, David Stevenson himself inspired one of her poems, a kind of 19th century version of Alanis Morissette's You Ought to Know. "I had a lover, he loveth me not. His way he went, and me forgot." Mary writes that, "At the time of my arrival in the settlement, things had not long passed the stage of utter and continued hardship, the time when food consisted solely of beans, relieved by an occasional monkey. My first house was of grass walls, grass windows, grass roof. It had no fireplace, no door, floor of clay. If you sat too long on a stool, the legs of the stool sank inches into the floor. Things were bleak enough at the outset that Mary even threw out a line to her old suitor, Henry Lawson. Communism as we have it is all right, Henry, and we are getting on. Slowly, of course, but in a year or two what now is will have gone, drowned by prosperity. And the country, it is a constant wonder to me, so beautiful, so rich in bird, insect, and plant. And the history and the stories of the war. If you are only here, Henry, don't let someone else snap your chances. Come while the field is new. P.S. I didn't get married." But they both must have known that New Australia was no place for Henry Lawson. Even her inviting and somewhat cheeky postscript that put her back on the market wasn't enough in Henry's mind to counterbalance the prospect of living in a commune that shunned alcohol. And while Mary was grappling with having the rug pulled out from under her by David Stevenson, William Lane was getting weirder and weirder. After the second fleet of colonists failed to right the sinking ship, one member said of Lane that, "I have seen him pondering difficulties with such intense involution as to have excited a species of mental frenzy." Like many struggling politicians seeking a rebrand after a scandal, William Lane decided that the problem with old New Australia was that it was not godly enough. While Lane himself had never hidden his religious inclinations, freedom of religion was baked into the original commune charter, and now he saw that laxity as its fatal flaw. In Cosme, God would be more front and centre. A piece he sent for publication back in the New Australia Journal in Sydney shed some light on what his mental state was like at this time. "To me, turning with aching heart from wrangling and groping, truth has whispered. To me, sinking in self-knowing agony on the dungeon floor of life, freedom has shown what might be. To me, faltering often because wrong triumphs, the knowledge of how justice is ever done has come. For God has given a task to me who am unworthy, and has not deserted me altogether. This new religious focus did not have the unifying effect that Lane hoped for. One settler said, "He is a madman, a knave seized with the madness of ambition, overpowered by the divinity of himself and his mission." Yeah, everything was starting to get a little bit Wicker-man-y. Both the morals and the morale of the colonists was suffering. In both New Australia and Cosme, people were finding that the socialist ideals they had enshrined were being systematically undermined. People were accused of stealing tools, hiding money, and taking more than their fair share. One disillusioned New Australian settler put it bluntly, "However workable communism may be for angels, we were not suited for it. Communism is an exceeding high religion. In practice, it is only a chosen few who are fit to live that high life." But it was in the miserable setting of Cosme that Mary found love, not with Henry or David, but with a quiet shearer from Victoria called William Gilmore. He lacked the braggadocio of David Stevenson and the intense brilliance of Henry Lawson, but William Gilmore seems, from all accounts, like a genuinely pretty good guy. He was a bush worker with no formal education after the age of 10. Their meet cute in the colony could have easily been penned by Banjo Patterson or William Lane in one of their romantic moods. A kid swing set started to collapse, and Will Gilmore heroically stepped in and held up the main beam with his back, taking the weight until the children had gotten to safety. While he was recuperating in bed, Mary took to reading to him, and visited him every day in the colony hospital. After he recovered, they took long walks together in the Paraguayan jungle, and their marriage announcement took no one by surprise. Said one colonist of the match, "Neither of the two look any better for it. He is quieter than ever, and the lady looks as if she has had a fit." But the two got hitched on the 29th of May, 1897. Their marriage took place in Cosme, and their vows to each other were accompanied by an oath to pledge continued loyalty to Cosme, in prosperity or in adversity, and that you will work for and cherish your fellow members and their families as they work for and cherish you and yours. Just your typical happy cult wedding. But the colony was already winding down by this stage, and with it the allure of living in South America. When Mary left the colony to travel to a hospital in order to give birth to her son in 1898, funds were so tight that she had to travel by herself, and couldn't even afford to send a telegram back to Will to let him know that he was a father. She writes, "I got into the train, wet, cold, and alone, and there I travelled in a filthy third-class carriage full of natives, of whose language I was quite ignorant, all smoking, men and women alike, with baskets of meat here and there on the floor, gamecocks perched on the backs of the seats, and young pigs in bags among our feet." William Lane abandoned Cosme in 1899, though he didn't quite put it like that, and the Gilmore family followed suit a mere 2 weeks later, with Will leaving the socialist commune for shearing work in South America, while Mary stayed at the colony to nurse her baby, Billy. This period of post-commune South American life was the hardest and most miserable time in their lives together. In a letter to Will from Cosme, Mary discussed how hard she found it, nursing her baby in such a harsh environment. "Dear little man in spasms of pain bit pieces out of his lip. I found them when he vomited. Somehow, the cold selfishness of my near neighbours has given my feelings towards communism the severest blow it has received yet. Neither inquired after Billy, though they passed the door daily, and neither offered a bite to eat, yet they knew Billy was so bad I could do little else than watch him. Indeed, I had to live part of the time on half-raw potatoes. So much for their communism. I have such a hatred of this place, where people seem so meanly selfish, and those who are not selfish are such liars you can't believe a word they say. I wouldn't mind cooperation, but no more communism for me if I can help it. The result is not worth the suffering and disappointment it entails. It is a very sick, miserable, unhappy colony just now, and I find it one of life's satisfactions that I no longer belong to it." Mary left the colony for good in May 1900, and was glad to see the back of it. "We called ourselves communists," she said. "We were only Laneites. And when we drifted away from, or lost the personal influence of William Lane, we ceased to believe communism a possible and livable doctrine, at least for today. Lane's influence was a marvellous thing. I never knew anyone, either man or woman, to come under it without their making a definite effort to be better. It was this which held the colony together, under circumstances which would have broken up anything." This brings part 3 to a close. In the next and final part of this episode, the deterioration of Henry, and the deaths and legacies of our 3 currency lads.